Okay, welcome everybody. It looks like one of our presenters is having trouble connecting, but hopefully we'll be able to get that sorted. Welcome to our end of project webinar on assessing the sensory needs of autistic adults. This is a project that we have been doing for a long time. It is a project that isn't in the end what we had planned to do, and it's a project that's been interrupted by COVID, and so we'll take you through some of the changes and some of the issues that we experienced with the project as we go along. Delighted to be joined by Dr. Damian Milton, and hopefully at some stage we will be joined by Jane Pringle as well. The final member of the project team was Professor Julie Beadle-Brown, who did some work with us around the statistical analysis, but she's not present, she's not here today. So in terms of an overview of the session, there was the introduction to the project team. We've planned a presentation, and hopefully we'll be presenting for about 30 or 40 minutes. Damian's going to start off by talking to us about some of the background information, and then he's going to hand over to Jane, who will give us a bit more information about the methods and what we plan to do and what we ended up doing. I'm going to take you through some of the results and start to talk to you about some of the limitations. And then Damian's going to talk to us about what we think might be some of the implications of our findings, and hopefully that will start a discussion. We're not using the chat function today. You are welcome to use it, but we'll not be monitoring that. The session is being recorded, and we will be making that recording available on the Tizard YouTube channel. Please do use the question and answer function so that you can type questions in for us to answer. And at the end of the seminar, at the webinar, you will get a sheet that will pop up. If you want to give us any feedback, then that's something that would be really helpful. Jane, can you hear us now, and can we hear you?
I can't see you.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
That's okay, that's okay. We'll go on, and I'm going to hand you over to Damian, and if it comes to your slides, Jane, and you still can't connect properly, I'm very happy to do those, so please don't worry about it. Okay, over to you, Damian.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. So as attendees to this webinar should already know, the differing sensory experiences of autistic people are highly reported and have been reported since the earliest published autobiographical accounts and resultant behavioural responses in accounting for those from the earliest clinical accounts. It has been more recently, however, that sensory issues have become part of diagnostic manuals like the DSM, for example, in 2013. And this is partly because of historically how the diagnostic systems work. So I won't get into too much detail. But much of this emphasis around sensory perceptual differences came from autistic people themselves. And these differences have been reported to be experienced as between 45 to 95% of those diagnosed as autistic, depending on different studies and how they measured it. So, historically, some researchers have often thought that these differences were more the consequences of more fundamental differences in social cognition. However, other researchers, such as myself, have argued somewhat the opposite, that sensory issues are somewhat a core cognitive difference of what autism is. with cascading effects around social interaction and so on. There was a systematic review that Burns et al. Completed in 2017, looking into the kind of assessments used around sensory needs. And they found that the most commonly used measure was the sensory profile as developed by Winnie Dunn. And this sensory profile was, and the theory behind it was somewhat developed from the earlier work of Jean Ayres. And I'll get on to a bit of that later with the sensory profiling. But Burns et al. Concluded that these measures did not use well-established psychometric properties and that further validation of these measures were required, and that a multi-method practical approach was needed for assessment that included observation. And something to remember about many of these assessments currently in use is that they're not specific to autistic people. One assessment that was designed by Olga Bogdashina, and this was from observations with autistic people, but was not a standardized test, although a lot of work on these issues has been based on that since as well. Next slide. So despite the importance of sensory experiences in the lives of autistic people, there's still limited research and consensus on appropriate methods to even assess such sensory differences. Currently, Ayres and Dunn's sensory assessment tools are the most established in the academic literature, and are based on the theoretical frameworks of sensory integration and what's called the 4-quadrant model, which kind of, sorry. Room for now. Yes, the 4-quadrant model, which somewhat splits people into 4 different types of sensory processing issues, which has some issues with it as a model, because for autistic people, they at different contexts and times may fit all 4 of these quadrants, as it were. So, however, these frameworks are not autism specific, and there's a dearth of studies investigating how the information gained from the assessment tools are used to improve the lives of autistic people. Next slide. And there's theoretical and practical issues with the current assessments used in practice. One of the problems of the Bogdashina checklist, the original one, is it had over 200 checklist items, so it was very long and impractical to use. There's also been precious little work in relation to measuring the match or lack thereof between individual sensory sensitivities with environmental adjustments. Currently, little is known about the similarities or differences between informant and self-reports of sensory sensitivities, whether these sensitivities are adjusted for in the environments people inhabit, or potential differences in sensory experiences between autistic people who do or do not have additional intellectual disability. So is Jane able to take over? Or shall I present this slide? I can carry on.
I don't think Jane can. Damian, do you want me to present these bits?
I'm happy to do this one if you want to carry on from the methods bit.
Sure.
So before COVID struck, We had quite grand plans for our project to investigate sensory needs and sensory environments of autistic adults with intellectual disability within often care settings we were looking to work with. To ask paid support staff and family carers to complete a questionnaire about sensory needs, carrying out observations of the environment, interviewing autistic people using adaptive communication methods, and interviewing staff. We had a plan of building a community of practice, giving resources around sensory needs, and comparing this as a kind of support strategy or intervention with less support or just the resources on their own and so on. To carry out assessments and observations and interviews again at the end of the process. So we had all of these things planned out, but unfortunately COVID came along and we couldn't work directly with people anymore. So all this went out the window, at least for now, and hopefully we might be able to come back to it at a later point.
So what did we end up doing? Plan B, C, D, E, F, you name it, we had to think about it. So in the end, what we did was we developed an online survey thinking about individual sensory needs, and we used and adapted the Autism Education Trust checklist, and that comes from the work of Bob Tashina. And we also developed an assessment of the environment. Now, this wasn't something we had ever set out to do. We had never set out to develop an individual assessment or to develop an assessment of the environment, but needs must, and that's what we ended up doing. Prior to COVID, we were able to go in and get some information from staff and spend some time with individuals, and also to carry out some observations of the environment. And so we were able to base the environment assessment on some of the work that Jane had been doing, making those observations. So in terms of the individual checklist, we had a number of items, and you can see some examples of those items there. Resist change to routine, prefers to sit at the back or the front of group, covers ears when hears certain sounds, can hear sounds that others do not hear. And our checklists and our surveys were distributed via Qualtrics, and we collected all of that data online. So for the checklist about individual needs, people were asked to say whether or not that was an issue for them, yes or no, or whether it was something that they didn't know. And initially, because the funding for this work came from the John and Lorna Wing Foundation and was very much about autistic people who had intellectual disabilities, that was the group of people who we were recruiting as participants. And so our initial surveys were for informants to fill in, so somebody who knew the individual well. In terms of our environment checklist, we had questions, and the question was always, which statement best describes the environment? And then there were a series of options, and the person completing the form, initially it was an informant, these were either paid support staff or family carers, were asked to select from those statements the one that they felt best suited the environment that the person was being the environment they were reporting about. And we got them at the start of the survey to say what sort of environment that was, whether it was home or whether it was a day centre or whether it was education, wherever that was. So for an example here, there's a high degree of predictability across the days and weeks what is happening is clearly communicated and there's a mechanism in place to communicate changes. Or there are some methods in place to indicate what is happening, for example, verbal agreement, but there's little consistency in routine across the days or weeks. For example, variation in times of meals or tasks, activities, or there's no rhythm to the day and nothing in place to communicate what or when things are happening. Now, we were acutely aware that we were asking people to complete information during COVID, a time when people working in social care settings were experiencing great demands on their time and great challenges. And so we didn't have any open-ended questions. We were designing these to make them as quick as possible for people to fill in. We were aware that people might think that those statements didn't really suit. And so we had a don't know or not sure option. And then we also had a not applicable option. This isn't something that's applicable to the person I'm completing this questionnaire for. So in terms of our participants, we had 196 surveys that were completed. And during the later stages, we did open up our survey, partly in response to feedback, but partly because we were aware that we were needing to get some more data to include autistic adults who self-reported. And so we had 138 autistic adults who self-reported, and we had 58 surveys completed by informants, and so either family carers or paid support staff. And in terms of the types of environments that people told us about, for the autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities, most people told us about a home environment, but we did have some people who talked to us, reported, they didn't talk to us, they filled in the information about day provision, short breaks, and various other environments. In terms of the autistic adults who self-reported, the picture was a little bit different in that we had some people who told us about a home environment, but more people who told us about a work environment. Some people also reported about an educational context, and then we had some other reports from other environments as well. In terms of our analysis, what we were doing was looking at people's identified sensory needs. And so where somebody had said, this is an issue for me, or this is an issue for the person who I am supporting or caring for, we had a look at what was happening in terms of the support that was provided for that identified need in the environment. So for an example there, the individual item resists change to routine. We looked at the environmental item, which included a high degree of predictability that was clearly communicated. That would be a full match. If the person had ticked little consistency and only some methods to communicate change, we would have coded that as a partial match. So some support in place, but not full support. And if they'd said no rhythm and to the day and no mechanism to communicate, we would have coded that as no match. If they said they didn't know or were not sure, or if they said it was not applicable, then that wasn't something that we coded. And so it was a fairly blunt instrument in terms of getting people to identify what was the most likely, which of those statements best describe their environment, and then trying to map sensory needs onto that. Okay, so in terms of the results, autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities, their informants told us about a range of sensory needs. On average, people had 17 sensory needs, but there was a range. And so some people had as few as 6 sensory needs identified, and some people had as many as 32. In terms of the average percentage of items identified as an issue, that was 46%. When we looked at autistic adults who self-reported and so filled in the survey about themselves, those figures were different. The mean number of issues identified was 21, and so autistic adults tended to identify more issues and tended to have a higher percentage of items that were identified as an issue. So autistic adults reported higher levels of sensory needs in comparison to the proxy reports of the autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities. And that didn't seem very likely to us. We couldn't really think why an autistic adult who had intellectual disabilities would have fewer sensory needs than an autistic adult who didn't have intellectual disabilities. Now, we're quite limited in terms of what we can think about, how we can interpret that data, because we hadn't originally set up the study in that way. But what is it that might be going on that could help us to understand why we're seeing that difference, that autistic adults who have intellectual disabilities have fewer sensory needs recognised and identified? Well, one thing that we thought was interesting to look at were the number of I don't know responses on the individual survey. If you look at autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities, and so where informants were filling in that information, there was a really high percentage number of don't know responses. If you look at the autistic adults who were self-reporting, there were still some issues that people were not sure about, but fewer of those. And statistically, that was different. If your questionnaire was being completed by somebody who knew you well, and you were an autistic adult with intellectual disabilities, your informant was much more likely to respond, I don't know, to a number of issues. That wasn't always the case though, and there are some issues where autistic adults were less likely than proxy informants to identify an item as being a sensory issue. And those items are bangs, objects and doors, is attracted to sound and noise, seems unaware of temperature and dislikes crunchy or chewy food. Okay, so those were 4 areas where autistic adults who did not have intellectual disabilities were less likely to identify something as being a sensory need. Damian's going to talk a little bit about why that might be the case in the discussion, because we've got some ideas, although we can't be sure. When we looked at the match between having an issue identified and having your environment adapted to meet that need, again, we found some differences. You need to bear in mind here that we have fewer participants in our sample who are autistic adults who have intellectual disabilities, and we need to keep that in mind. Those were our smallest group of participants. But informants were much more likely to report support for an issue being in place. People without intellectual disabilities had more items scored as being not in place. So is one of our conclusions there that if you are an autistic adult who has intellectual disabilities, you're more likely to get your needs met? your sensory needs met? Well, probably not, because we need to take into account the very high percentage of don't know responses. I'm not sure, we've got some, again, Damian will talk to you, we've got some possible ideas about why that might be one of our findings. Just in terms of the number of matches, if you were an autistic adult with intellectual disabilities, the average number of full matches was 7.6. If you were an autistic adult who self-reported, the average number of full matches was just over 5. And so informants reported that the person that they supported and cared for was much more likely to have their individual needs met within the environment. One of the other things that we looked at for people was whether there were differences in different environments. And for autistic adults who didn't have intellectual disabilities, one of the things that the data seems to be suggesting is that identified needs were less likely to be met in a work than in a home environment. And that was interesting, and it wasn't accounted for by people who reported about that environment having a different number of sensory needs identified. Now, again, we need to be cautious there, because we were not asking people to complete the survey about different environments. We were asking people to identify one environment to complete the survey in. One of the other things that we thought was interesting was that on 17 items, the environment was rated as having support for an area being in place, even though a need in that area had not been identified. And so these were the responses where where people had said, this is not a need for this person. This area is not a sensory need, but yet they had described the environment as being an environment that you would see, that you would need if you had that particular issue. And that was the case for 25% or more of the sample that included people with intellectual disabilities. If you just looked at autistic adults who didn't have intellectual disabilities, there were still occasions where that happened, but it was fewer occasions. So is there something that's happening there in terms of support being provided in the environment so that a sensory need might not be recognised because the person is being supported in that way? We don't know. Just before I hand over to Damian to start us thinking about the discussion, just do want to reiterate that there are a number of limitations. We did have fewer autistic participants who had intellectual disabilities. We have no idea whether the data that people gave us reflects their experience and practice. And I think that's an issue for the autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities, where the survey was being completed by informants. We don't know whether what they said about the support that was in place, it reflects the experience of the autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities. There was no space in the questionnaire for any qualitative exploration, and whilst that was an intentional strategy on our part, because this was taking place during COVID and we needed to make sure that people could complete the questionnaires quickly, it really does limit our ability to interpret some of those findings. And then just to acknowledge that everybody's experience during COVID-19 was different. And so we cannot really claim that we were collecting data at a time when when people were in environments that were typical, because most people had experienced at least some changes to those environments. I'm going to pass you back to Damian now, who's going to talk us through some of the points for discussion and some of our thoughts so far.
Hello everyone again. Some of the sensory issues may be more pronounced for autistic people with intellectual disability, but it might be more difficult for, say, the informants or outsiders to assess this from the perspective of an onlooker, so someone not experiencing it themselves, unless clearly indicated through the autistic person's actions in some way. So someone may be highly stressed by a sensory environment that's shut down and withdraw a bit, and it might not be obvious to onlookers. They might mask their difficulties in front of others. All these various issues could be at play. But such differences could have serious implications for practice when interventions are largely based upon behavioural observation, and non-autistic people may struggle to empathise with autistic ways of being in the world. So if something isn't that obvious, then it quite likely is going to be missed, or we might get these don't knows, as was mentioned earlier. But even if we look at the questionnaire data, I made a note of this earlier when Jill was going through it, even if those 7.6 on average needs are being met in the environment, they reported 17 on average sensory needs. So about 9.5 on average sensory needs that are known about are still not being met. And for autistic adult self-reporting, that was 5.1 on average being met out of 21 issues on average reported. So there's kind of 16 not being met there. So even taking it at face value, there's a gap there that needs addressing. So it may be the case that autistic adults without intellectual disability might mask particular sensory seeking behaviour and out in certain environments, public work and so on, in fear of social sanction and stigma. So some of the items that did come out as higher for those with intellectual disability were things like banging doors and objects. If you were to do this in certain environments, you might get arrested for it or something. So whilst these findings can only indicate potential issues in these areas, obviously further research is needed to address how autistic people not only experience the sensorium, but how best to adjust environments to support such needs. But clearly there's a gap there. So these findings might suggest autistic adults have greater awareness and potentially insight regarding their own sensory needs. It's possible this could extend to checks on the environment or the sensory needs of other autistic people. There may be caveats to that as well, but say an autistic person working alongside an occupational therapist looking at sensory environments, this could be an intervention that would be a fruitful area to research in the future. So to conclude, in the development of this study, it was found that the various available sensory checklists suggest that there are many ways of measuring sensory issues and collating varied information for autistic people based on different underlying constructs. this suggests that there may be a lack of consensus and considerable variation regarding the concept and its definition, and therefore how to help people as well. Further research is needed to refine sensory assessments that capture the experiences of autistic people as a specific group, as well as well-defined environmental assessments so that adjustments can be made. Because up until now, those environmental assessments have been pretty thin on the ground in terms of research, at least, to non-existent in those terms. So lots of references. We'll share the slides and recordings somehow afterwards.
Thank you very much, Damian. Jane, are you able to connect with us yet? No, doesn't look like it. Okay, it looks like we have some questions in the chat. Oh, so somebody said they didn't have any sound. Hopefully that resolved itself. I'm hoping it did, and certainly didn't involve everybody. So a question from Jill Corbyn. Do we know if any of the proxy reporters were also autistic? We didn't ask for any information about the proxy reporters, so no, that isn't information we had, but that would be interesting, wouldn't it?
It would certainly be interesting to do a similar study with autistic adults, say, meeting people and getting to know them perhaps, or looking at environments and so on. So where we have informants saying the sensory needs are in place in the environment, they're being met, the autistic adults might say, well, no, they're not. Yeah. So that would be very interesting to do some follow-up studies on this.
But I think what Jill is asking there is whether, so we could have done that, we didn't, but it is likely, isn't it, that some of our respondents in our survey were autistic and were also reporting about another autistic adult. But no, I'm really sorry, Jill. I'm afraid we don't have any of that data. We got any more questions?
We probably wouldn't have had a high enough number to compare, to be honest, in this data, but it would be something to look into in the future.
Yeah. Are people all right to type their questions in the question and answer box? I'm going to pass this one to Damian. Jill, do you have any reflections on how to improve and ensure the quality of sensory assessments that are currently available? Damian and Melina Mali, who was involved in the early part of the project, did all the work on looking at the quality of sensory assessments. So I shall hand that one over to you, Damian.
I think in some ways we need to almost start again and develop them. The current ones, airs and done related work, the theory behind it is quite deficit based, and there's other issues with the theory as well. And then once the assessment's done, what do you do about these sensory needs? So I would suggest moving away from desensitization type techniques and more towards environmental adjustments. And that's why we had quite a strong focus on the environmental adjustments, because this has hardly been looked at in literature at all. But to see if that really makes a difference, we'd need to do more in-depth research like we were planning to do originally. So in theory, one one model might work better than the other, but we don't really know for sure. I think, though, that the theory behind the current assessments is has issues with it. It's not autism specific. The ones that are autism specific are not standardized and haven't been tested fully. So there's problems with all the current assessments being used in practice. And I'm sure that some others have been developed by people, but probably not fully tested either. So we need to pool all of these resources, have experts from practice, autistic adults, really crunch down what's good and what's not about it, and then do the research to test it out to see if it does help in practice. But I think it needs more than assessments of the environment. It also needs that practical reflection. And that's why I think building communities of practice over time with input from these various people can help build better environments for people. I know Jill's involved with a lot of work in this area about practically making a difference, and I think more work's needed, but also we know there's a problem and need to act upon it now as well. But if, as we do, we can test that out and gather the data to see what's working. So massive room for improvement is my answer to that one.
Okay. The next question is one from Kathy. I would have to go back and look at the data to confirm that, Kathy, but I don't think there was anybody who said that their sensory needs were almost all met. I have to say, though, that I suspect, or it might be possible that people were answering about environments. They chose which environment they were answering about. And I wonder if for some of the autistic adults, they might have had home environments where many of their or more of their needs were met. I don't know. I will have a look at the data and do email me, and I'll see if I can answer that one. Jill, you asked us about will the assessments be available to use, and so we are still finalising those. I guess yes, we probably will make them available, but I am slightly concerned about that because we didn't set out to make an assessment. The process that we followed is not the process that you would use to develop an assessment, and so we are not at all saying that you know, come and use our assessments because they're brilliant. We were making the most of what we had. We were taking the AET assessment, we were adjusting some of the language, and we were then looking at matching our questions about the environment to that assessment.
I think the way we designed the questionnaires was somewhat based around the AET, Autism Education Trust individual assessment. And this was a shortened version of the Bob Sheena one. So neither of which are standardized or lead to what you're meant to do with this assessment. And that is somewhat problematic. And also the AET assessment had double questions in it, areas which weren't really related to sensory issues so much, and areas which weren't in it, which needed to be added. And so we had to shift that around. It was simply an exploratory questionnaire. Coming up with a really good assessment tool would be a major piece of work, I think, but really needs to be done.
Absolutely.
And Next question.
I think it's a comment really. So Kathy says the quality of the assessment was eye-opening, took a year to get it funded. Yeah, it's a real problem, isn't it? It's a real issue in terms of...
I think there's issues there as well, the cost and of a private sensory assessment, or just say a service calling in an occupational therapist in order to do an in-depth assessment, who knows about the Ayres and Dunn models and perhaps some of their weaknesses. If they're an autism specialist as well, it's probably quite rare to get a really good report. And then it costs a lot, or it might not happen in certain areas, or be a delay for it. We need better sensory awareness, understanding for frontline staff. The everyday support people need to know how to assess sensory needs, or if something's going wrong in this area, and call people in if there's more of a crisis. So there needs to be much better awareness and training across all staff who care for autistic people.
Yeah, and I think that final question there, is there a way to prove that spending money, well, probably not a way to prove it, but we could certainly do some research, and that's something that is absolutely needed, to look at what happens if we provide environments that meet people's sensory needs. And my suspicion is that if we provided environments that better met people's sensory needs, then that would obviously be an initial outlay in terms of the adaptations that were needed, but that would actually be very cost effective, and would of course have big implications for people's quality of life. Damian, I'm sure you want to comment there as well.
I've been involved in a large project with the National Autism Project, which was looking at the finances around intervention strategies, and it was very difficult for them to advise on anything being strongly evidence-based, and even more difficult to say it'd be good value for money. However, there were areas which looked promising, and I think something like this would be, as Jill said, there'd be an initial outlay, but I think the cost savings over time would be huge if you were meeting people's needs. Their lives would be more fulfilled, they'd have less distress and spiral of chronic distress. And it would be cheaper in the long run, because if you think of people hitting crisis and how costly that is for everyone concerned, and not only financially, this is a really major issue, but this is just a starting point. This kind of research highlights there's an issue, not really how we solve it, but I think adjusting the environments are huge to this.
Okay. I think we've got, I'm not sure whether Keith has, so Keith has said is interested in understanding of sensory needs based on the specific demands of a task, interaction and environment. Yes, so that's not something that we looked at, or our questionnaires about sensory needs were not as specific as that, and the information that we provided in terms of different types of support from an environment also wouldn't have covered any of those things that you are thinking about.
Just have to agree though with regards to the ethos of a more person-centered focus and working collaboratively. Wherever possible. Every person's profile is going to come out differently, so there may be general issues around things like predictability and things coming out of the blue, as it were. But in terms of likes and dislikes, preferences, you can have one autistic person with almost the opposite extreme profile to the next autistic person. So the nuances of sensory needs, it very much needs a person-centered focus. But it needs recognition in the first place. And just that basic understanding seems to be missing a lot of the time.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's crucial.
Were there any trends with the main sensory challenges people were experiencing? There were. So
Were some.
The area that 93% of people told us was difficult was finds crowded areas difficult. The second,
not very surprising.
the second highest was distressed by certain sounds, followed by prefers to sit at front or back of group, followed by is startled when approached by others, followed by dislikes bright lights. So there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There were 12 of the sensory needs that were reported as issues by over 75% of people, and that was the group combined.
So some are very common issues and easily observed perhaps and reported on compared to others. But there were some items where there was a very large gap on the individual items between the informant and the self-reported. So like some in the self-reported were up in the 80, 90%, but in the informant were 40, 50%. So there was some gaps there to look into in more depth, perhaps.
Yeah. I think this should probably be our final question. Do you think your research has implications for education settings? Yes, absolutely. Yes, definitely. And if
seen some horror shows in my time.
Yeah. It wouldn't take us very much to collect that data from education environments. And then one final question that's just sneaked in. Were any details asked about additional sensory issues, visual or hearing impairments? No, we didn't. We kept it. So partly this was an issue about ethics and us not collecting any identifiable data. And so the decision to do that meant that we made something that was very quick to fill in, but that's something that we don't have any information about, and that would obviously be something that would be very interesting in relation to our findings.
I mean, something I've been involved in a group recently where one of the participants was talking about their child who had multiple sensory impairment but wasn't autistic, but could relate to a lot of back and forth of what we were talking about in terms of some of the things people miss out on, like the stress and the cognitive load of dealing with the sensory inputs and integration and so on. And there was the need for clarity and predictability. There was quite a lot of crossover there. So I think there's similarities to look into as well as intersectional combined issues and things like that. But a lot of this is watch this space, I guess, because despite there being in recent years more work identifying sensory needs in autistic people, there hasn't been this translation into practice. Most of what people are using is rather dated general occupational therapy theory. So we need to do better.
Yeah. That sounds to me like a good note to end it on. We need to do better. Call to arms, absolutely. Jane, I'm so sorry that you had technical issues. So I am going to end the recording there. I will let people know by